In 1950, an American statistician boarded a plane to Tokyo carrying ideas about manufacturing quality that no major American company wanted to hear. His name was W. Edwards Deming, and he'd spent years trying to convince Detroit that the way they built cars was fundamentally flawed. But Detroit was selling more cars than it could build. Why would they listen to a statistician from Wyoming? So Deming went to Japan instead. And what happened over the next 3 decades quietly reshaped the automobile industry in ways that are still visible on every highway today. W. Edwards Deming grew up on a 40-acre homestead outside Powell, Wyoming. His family lived in a tar paper shack during the early years. As a boy, he hauled wood and coal to a nearby hotel to earn money for his family, and that childhood left him with 2 things that never faded: a deep hatred of waste and a belief that ordinary workers deserved respect. He studied engineering at the University of Wyoming, working as a janitor to pay his way through school. He later earned a doctorate in physics from Yale and eventually landed at the United States Census Bureau. Along the way, he became fascinated with statistical quality control, the idea that you could study the variation in a manufacturing process, identify problems early, and fix them before they produce defective products. His mentor, Walter Schuhart at Bell Laboratories, had developed the concept using control charts and probability theory. Instead of catching defects at the end of the line, you could prevent them from happening in the first place. During World War II, Deming trained American engineers in these methods to boost wartime production. The training worked. Factories got more efficient, defect rates dropped, and output surged. American manufacturing had never been more disciplined. But when the war ended, so did American interest in quality control. Demand for consumer goods was exploding, and companies figured they could sell anything they made, flaws and all. Why invest in prevention when customers were lined up at the door? Deming tried to get the attention of American executives, but his message about long-term quality fell on ears that only wanted to hear about short-term volume. As one account later put it, the North American business world never realized that the 14 principles of one man could help build an empire. Japan had the opposite problem entirely. The country was flattened, its cities reduced to rubble from Allied bombing. 2 of them had been obliterated by atomic weapons. Japan had almost no natural resources and a shattered economy. If the country was going to survive, it needed to export high-quality goods to the rest of the world. So in 1950, the Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers invited Deming to Tokyo. He accepted immediately. Over 8 days, Deming lectured to hundreds of Japanese engineers and business executives in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Fukuoka. 80% of Japan's top industrial leaders attended. He told them something that must have sounded borderline reckless at the time. He predicted that if they followed his methods, Japan would be competing with the best manufacturers in the world within 5 years. However, what Deming taught was not just statistics. He taught a philosophy. Stop inspecting products at the end of the line and start building quality into the process itself. Treat workers as partners, not cogs. Measure everything, improve constantly, and never stop asking why something went wrong. The Japanese did more than listen. They followed his methods to the letter. Within 18 months, factories across Japan were reporting dramatic improvements in both quality and productivity. And from that foundation, something extraordinary emerged inside one car company in particular. At Toyota, an engineer named Taiichi Ono was already thinking along similar lines. Between 1948 and 1975, Ono and Toyota president Eiji Toyoda developed what became known as the Toyota Production System. It was built on 2 pillars that would reshape global manufacturing. The first was just-in-time production. Instead of stockpiling massive inventories of parts, Toyota produced only what was needed when it was needed. Ono got the idea not from other car factories, but from watching how American supermarkets restocked their shelves. A customer takes a product, the shelf gets refilled with only enough to replace what was taken. Simple in concept, radical in execution. The second pillar was called Jidoka, automation with a human touch. Toyota installed a system where any worker on the assembly line could pull a cord called the and-on cord and stop the entire production line if they spotted a defect or a problem. In an American factory at the time, stopping the line was unthinkable. It cost money every second the machine sat idle, but Toyota believed it was cheaper to stop and fix a problem immediately than to let a defective car reach the customer. Wrapped around both pillars was the philosophy of Kaizen, which translates loosely to continuous improvement. Kaizen wasn't about big, dramatic overhauls. It was about small, steady refinements happening every single day, at every level of the company, from the executive suite down to the newest worker on the floor. But Toyota did not stop at Kaizen alone. They paired it with a problem-solving technique called the 5 whys. When something went wrong, workers were trained to ask why it happened, and then ask why again and again 5 times until they reached the root cause. A transmission that failed at 80,000 miles was not merely a bad transmission. It was an invitation to trace the failure back to the specific process, the specific machine, the specific gap in procedure that allowed the flaw to exist. This approach meant that problems once found rarely recurred. The culture this created inside Toyota factories was fundamentally different from what existed in Detroit. In American plants during the 1960s and 70s, assembly line workers were expected to keep their heads down and hit their quotas. Quality was the inspector's job, not theirs. Suggesting improvements to management wasn't part of the culture, and in many cases it was actively discouraged. Toyota flipped that model completely. By the early 1950s, the company had launched a creative idea suggestion system, inviting every employee to submit improvements. The number of suggestions grew year after year, and many of them were implemented directly on the factory floor. The word Kaizen itself had roots in an American training film shown to Japanese workers after the war called Improvement in 4 Steps. So in a way, the philosophy that would define Japanese manufacturing had American fingerprints all over it. But American car companies were doing the opposite of everything Toyota had learned. They were chasing volume, prioritizing style over substance, and treating quality control as somebody else's problem. And what were American workers doing when they spotted a defect on the line? In most plants, they were told to keep the line moving and let the inspectors deal with it downstream. However, that downstream fix cost 10 times more than catching the problem at the source, a lesson Toyota had already learned. Then came the moment that cracked the global oil market wide open. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed an oil embargo in response to Western involvement in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. The price of Arabian Light crude jumped from about $2.59 per barrel in January 1973 to $11.65 by January 1974. The effect on the American car market was devastating. Suddenly, the massive V8 engines and heavy steel bodies that Detroit had perfected for 2 decades became liabilities. Consumers who had never thought twice about fuel economy were now sitting in line for hours at gas stations, watching the price climb with every fill-up. In some states, gas stations used colored flags to signal whether they had any fuel left at all. Green meant available, red meant empty. 20% of American gas stations had no fuel at all by late February 1974. But Detroit's troubles went far deeper than long lines at the gas pump, and right there, waiting with exactly the cars America suddenly needed, were Toyota, Honda, and Datsun. Their vehicles were compact, fuel-efficient, and built with the kind of reliability that American small cars simply couldn't match. Detroit tried to respond with models like the Chevrolet Vega, the Ford Pinto, and the AMC Gremlin. But these cars were rushed to market with limited engineering refinement. The Vega was notorious for engine failures caused by its aluminum block warping under heat. The Pinto became synonymous with a fuel tank design that made it vulnerable in rear-end collisions. These were the cars America offered as its answer to the Toyota Corolla, and the difference in long-term dependability was impossible to ignore. The sales numbers tell the story of Detroit's collapse. Japanese market share in the United States climbed from around 9% in 1976 to 21% by 1980. In that same period, General Motors sales fell 34%. Ford dropped 47%. By the early 1980s, Japanese manufacturers had surpassed Detroit's production numbers for the first time in history. How did the biggest car companies on Earth lose their own market so quickly? What made this so painful for American manufacturers was not the sales loss alone. It was the realization that the quality gap was real, measurable, and deeply embedded in how each country built its cars. One of the most revealing examples comes from Ford itself. During this era, Ford was manufacturing a car model with two sources for its automatic transmission. One was built by Ford in the United States. The other was built by Mazda in Japan. Both transmissions were manufactured to the exact same engineering specifications, the same blueprints, the same tolerances. But Ford's own engineers were about to discover something even more unsettling. Customers had started specifically requesting the version with the Japanese-built transmission, and they were willing to wait weeks to get it. Ford engineers were baffled. They disassembled both versions and measured every part. The American-made components all fell within the specified tolerance ranges. They met the standard. But the Japanese-made components were clustered much more tightly around the target measurement. They did not merely meet the standard. They aimed for perfection within it. That is the difference between building to tolerance and building to ideal. Same blueprint, same specifications, and completely different results on the road. If you have been finding this useful, consider subscribing. We cover the real stories behind engineering, car history, and why things are built the way they are every single week. Now, the question worth asking is why the gap persisted even after American companies recognized the problem. Part of the answer is philosophical. Japanese manufacturers like Toyota and Honda tend to refine proven mechanical systems across multiple generations of a vehicle. They improve what already works on the factory floor rather than replacing it with something entirely new each time. This evolutionary approach means fewer undetected defects reach the customer because the core engineering has been tested and refined across millions of miles and millions of drivers. American manufacturers, particularly through the 1980s and the 1990s, leaned toward redesigning major systems with every new model generation. New engine architectures, new transmission designs, new electronics platforms. Each redesign introduced new variables, new potential failure points, and new problems that only appeared after thousands of customers had driven the cars for a few years. But American buyers were about to face a deeper question. Would you rather drive a car built on a platform refined over 15 years, or one designed from scratch 18 months ago? The answer seems obvious when you put it that way. However, the American market kept rewarding novelty, and manufacturers kept chasing it. The Toyota Corolla engine from 1990 shares fundamental design DNA with the Corolla engine from 2005. That continuity is not a sign of laziness. It is a deliberate strategy. Why replace something that works when you can make it work better? And this philosophy extends beyond the engine. Japanese manufacturers historically prioritized simplicity in design, using fewer complex systems that could fail independently. Fewer turbochargers, fewer electronically adjustable suspensions, fewer features that impressed on the showroom floor but created headaches at 150,000 miles. The results show up in the data year after year. Consumer Reports regularly places Toyota, Lexus, Honda, and Mazda in the top tier of reliability rankings. Ford, Chevrolet, and Ram tend to land in the lower half. Toyota and Honda engines and transmissions are frequently documented reaching 200,000 to 300,000 miles on standard maintenance alone. But the story does not end with Japan winning and America losing. That would be too simple, and it would not be accurate. In 1980, NBC aired a documentary that changed the conversation in American boardrooms overnight. It was called "If Japan Can, Why Can't We?" The program traced Japan's manufacturing miracle back to its source, and for the first time, millions of Americans saw the face of W. Edwards Deming on their television screens. The phone started ringing the next morning. Ford, General Motors, Xerox, Procter & Gamble, all of them suddenly wanted to learn what Deming had been teaching Japan for 30 years. Ford was the first major automaker to bring him in. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and its reputation for quality was dismal. Deming did not give Ford a quick fix. Instead, he questioned their entire corporate culture. Management, not workers, was responsible for 85% of quality problems, he told the executives. The employee rating system that ranked workers against each other had to go, replaced by coaching and cooperation. And Ford needed to stop blaming the assembly line and start examining its own decision-making processes. It was not a comfortable message, but Ford followed his advice. Within a few years, the results were undeniable. The company's profits began to exceed both General Motors and Chrysler. Some estimates put Ford's cost advantage over GM at $600 per car by the late 1980s. Ford even began running advertising campaigns that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, built around the slogan, "Quality is job one." But Japan had one more advantage that had nothing to do with factories at all, and it is one that rarely comes up in this conversation. Japan operates one of the strictest vehicle inspection systems in the world, known as Shaken. Every car in Japan must pass a rigorous safety and emissions inspection every 2 years, and the cost of keeping an older vehicle compliant pushes many Japanese owners to sell their cars relatively young. That created a second effect on how Japanese automakers designed their vehicles. Because Japanese manufacturers knew their vehicles would be scrutinized under tight inspection standards at home, they designed cars that could pass those standards reliably. What began as a domestic regulation became an engineering advantage that followed Japanese vehicles across the Pacific and into American driveways. However, American manufacturers were not standing still either. The gap between Japanese and American reliability has narrowed considerably since then. Modern American trucks and SUVs, especially naturally aspirated models like the Ford F-150 with its 5-liter V8, have earned genuine respect for durability. American manufacturers adopted many of the lean manufacturing principles that Toyota pioneered, and quality control across the industry is dramatically better than it was 40 years ago. But the philosophical difference between Japanese and American factories has not fully disappeared. Japanese manufacturers still tend to evolve, while American manufacturers still tend to reinvent. And that difference, invisible on a spec sheet but unmistakable over 200,000 miles, is why the conversation about Japanese reliability continues today. So why does any of this matter if you are shopping for a car right now? Because the philosophy behind a vehicle shapes everything you will experience over the next 10 or 15 years of owning it. The engine that starts on a cold morning at 200,000 miles did not get there by accident. It got there because someone, decades ago, decided that lasting longer was worth more than looking new. W. Edwards Deming died in December 1993 at 93 years old. He had spent his final decade doing exactly what he had always done, teaching, consulting, and insisting that quality was not a department, but a way of thinking. Inside Toyota's headquarters in Japan, there is a photograph of Deming hanging in a place of honor. Not because he was Japanese, because he was the man who taught them to build things that last. The real reason Japanese cars outlive American cars is not hidden in a factory or stamped on an engine block. It lives in a question that one country asked decades before the other was willing to hear it. What if we just built it right the first time?